children's rights, the UNCRC and incorporation. And I want to start off by introducing a brilliant picture that the Children's Parliament shared with me about the UNCRC. The UNCRC covers every aspect of children and young people's lives. And this is what the Children's Parliament really tried to get across in this picture that they drew of the Children's Rights House, the UNCRC House. The idea of the UNCRC House is that it contains everything that's within the UNCRC. And when you look at policy areas across Scottish Government, if people are talking about housing, housing is included in the UNCRC. If people are talking about adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed approaches, that's all about children's rights. If people are talking about transport, then that's all about children's rights. The environment, the UNCRC covers every single aspect of children and young people's rights. And it's so important to always remember that almost every conversation that you have, every decision that you make, particularly decisions that are made by the Scottish Parliament, by the Scottish Government, by local authorities, all of these decisions impact on children and young people and should be made thinking about the UNCRC because it covers every area of children and young people's lives. It's important as well to think about the principles of children and young people's rights. The fact that children and young people's rights are for all children, they're universal. So regardless of race, religion, abilities, family circumstances, every child and young person in Scotland should have the rights that are contained within the UNCRC. It's important as well to reflect that children's rights are unconditional. All children are entitled to all of the rights and they can't be given or taken away. Rights aren't a favour, rights are inherent to actually being a child or a young person. And so that kind of moves on to the next point, that rights are inalienable, they can't be given or taken away, and rights are inherent, they are permanent. Finally, rights are indivisible. And so you can't kind of pick and choose which rights you want to respect, which rights are the most important. Rights are completely interdependent and depend on each other to be effective. So, for example, the right to education can't be properly fulfilled unless you take into account the right of children and young people to be listened to and to have their views taken into account. Every right depends on other rights within the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to be properly realised. I'm now going to completely contradict you by only telling you about the 4 general principles of the UNCRC. But that's because if I go into detail on all of the 42 substantive rights, then I think we would probably be here all afternoon. So I think it's good to pull out the UNCRC general principles and to make sure that you always have these in mind in every decision that you're making. And because, like you can see, in the top box that I have here, it's the UNCRC preamble. Preamble is kind of UN speak for introduction. So in the introduction of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it talks about that, the fact that for children and young people's full and harmonious development of their personality, they should grow up in a family environment in an atmosphere of happiness, love and understanding. And I think if you look at all of the rights and look at the indivisibility of all of the rights, these are the rights that need to be upheld in order for children and young people to grow up in this atmosphere of happiness, love and understanding. So drawing out the 4 general principles, these have been kind of highlighted by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child of being of particular kind of importance and significance in every decision that affects children and young people's rights. And these 4 general principles are non-discrimination, best interests, survival and development, and children's participation. So non-discrimination isn't about treating every child equally. It's about making sure that every child has everything that they need to ensure equality of opportunity. So it's recognising that there are some children and young people whose rights are particularly at risk, and they may need additional support to make sure that their rights are fully realised. The best interest of the child, Article 3, is about making sure that the best interests of the child are at the heart of every decision that's made. And like I said when I was talking about the Children's Rights House, this isn't just in relation to children's services or education, it's in relation to everything. So transport, the environment, planning, all decisions need to have the best interests of children and young people at the very heart of them. Article 6, which is about survival and development, isn't just about what children need to survive, it's about what children need to thrive. So what children need to really reach their fullest potential and to be everything that they can be. And I think children's participation, Article 12, whilst it's the most well-known, I think, of all rights within the UNCRC, it's so important to remember that it's not just seeking the views of children and young people, it's actually taking those views into account. It's about acting on those views. And it's about making sure you provide feedback to children and young people about what you've done as a result of what they've told you. So always remember these 4 general principles of the UNCRC and put them at the heart of all the work that you're doing with and for children and young people. There are also 3 Ps, which is sometimes known as the 4 Ps because it's an extra one. And this is how you can divide the 42 rights within the UNCRC into provision. So this is what children and young people need, like shelter and education, food and nutrition, protection, so everything that needs to be put in place to protect children and young people from harm and exploitation, and participation, which isn't just Article 12, but it's also the right to information, the right to freedom of expression and freedom of movement. The 4th P that I've not included here is also promotion. So it's the important fact that actually children and young people need to know that they've got their rights if they're going to be able to claim them. So moving on to the next slide, then, as you all know, there have been steps taken to incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into law in Scotland. And so up until now, children's rights in Scotland have been something that government needs to think about, all levels of government need to think about, but they don't actually need to do. They don't, in law, it doesn't say they actually have to comply. And it means that if children and young people's rights are breached, then there's no way at the moment with many of the rights in the UNCRC that they can actually complain to the courts in the most serious of cases. So incorporation is about getting an international treaty and bringing it into domestic law to make it binding on all levels of government, so that it's not just something that people have to think about, but it's something that people have to do. And it gives children and young people the right to complain if they think their rights have been breached. So going on to the next slide, then the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child Incorporation Bill was passed unanimously by the Scottish Parliament on the 16th of March this year. As you all know, the bill was challenged by the UK government, not on the intent of the bill, so not around the children's rights aspects of it, but actually around the kind of constitutional areas. So whether the Scottish Parliament had the right to be able to produce a law that was so far-ranging to protect children's rights, or whether it may have trodden on Westminster's toes. The UK Supreme Court actually ruled last week to say that elements of the bill do need to be revised to make sure that they are within the competence of the Scottish Parliament. But we've had reassurance from the Deputy First Minister that the Scottish Government is still going to continue with the implementation programme at pace, and that they're committed to addressing the Supreme Court's judgment as soon as practicable. So we really want to see the work to really further children's rights in Scotland continue at speed. On the next slide, we will share these slides afterwards with you. But on the next slide, I've gone into some of the elements of the UNCRC Scotland bill, but I won't go on to the detail of that now because it would take far too long again. But it's just a brief summary of what's within the UNCRC Scotland bill. Obviously, there might be a few elements of this that are changed, but I think it's a useful slide just to see that summary. So yeah, we continue at pace to implement the CRC. This is one of the key events that Together holds to find out what we're doing, what's happening across Scotland to further children and young people's rights. Yeah, we're just looking forward to hearing from Bruce and from Lewis now about some of the work that they've been doing to embed children and young people's rights approach. So Bruce and Lewis, if I can maybe hand over to you now for your presentation. And like I've said, there will be an opportunity for questions after Bruce and Lewis's presentation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jules. What a great start to the session. And so Lewis and I are now going to talk a little bit about rights and a little bit about what taking a rights-based approach means. So I'll give a little bit of an introduction, and then I'll have a bit of a conversation with Lewis and draw out some of his experience as a young advisor. But I'll start off with a bit of an overview. I'm afraid I don't have beautiful slides like Juliet always does, filled with lots of really wonderful illustrations from children and young people. You'll just have me talking. But by way of introduction, just building on what Jules had said, there's a broad array of international human rights laws which protect children and young people, but the Convention on the Rights of the Child's really special. And as Jules said, it brings together all of the different parts of children's rights protection, civil and political rights, economic, social and cultural rights, and brings them all together based around this idea that those in power need to create an environment where children are able to grow up in a family environment of happiness and love and understanding. And it really builds on some of the foundations that we set up over the last 75 or so years with the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And right back at the start of that process, there was an understanding that childhood is special. It's a time of special care and assistance. And so it's really important that when we take a rights-based approach, when we look at how we ensure rights like an adequate standard of living or the highest attainable standard of health, or an education which develops children to their fullest potential, or the extra care and protection that we need to give to disabled children and care experienced children, it's always important that we take a rights-based approach. And a big part of that is, as Jules said, we've got the general principles and putting children's voice right at the heart of decision-making, but also using all available resources to the maximum extent possible. That's in Article 4 of the Convention, which requires states to do everything to pass all the laws, to pass all the policy, to change practice. And the incorporation of the CRC into domestic law, which Jules was talking about, is very much at the heart of our efforts to make sure that we take a proper approach to using all the tools available. The voice of children and young people are absolutely essential here. And again, you'll be hearing from Lewis shortly, but just to help set the tone, I always like to quote some of the work that we did a couple of years ago as part of the 30th anniversary of the CRC. And we asked children to come up with 7-word stories to explain why a rights-based approach and children's rights were so important to them. And we asked them to do it in just 7 words. And some of the ones that came out were things like, my rights give me power, freedom, and courage. My rights matter, your rights matter too. Be bold, be brave, speak out. My rights are my armor to me. These ideas that for children and young people, rights are something that gives power, are empowering and help children and young people be part of decision making. And as we approach the 32nd anniversary of the convention and the 30th anniversary of the UK's ratification, because it took the UK a little bit of time to sign up, pretty quick, but not instantly. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, which has disproportionately affected children and young people, and particularly around things like rights to education, health, family life, and together with friends. And we know that the biggest impact of the restrictions on COVID have been on those whose rights were already most at risk: disabled children, care experienced children, young carers, and those in poverty, and also the really profound impact on mental health. And so what does a rights-based approach to all of this mean? I'll briefly mention Laura Lundy's incredible work around participation of children and young people. I won't go into that in great detail, but I would refer you to it because she's done some really incredible work around particularly participation. But in terms of a kind of a broad rights-based approach, it's generally agreed that we can take 5 key principles. And in Scotland, we often use the acronym PANEL, P-A-N-E-L. It's not an acronym that works internationally, so you won't really see it a lot outside of Scotland, but these 5 principles are used kind of pretty broadly. And so participation, that children and young people should be involved in decision making, accountability, that there needs to be monitoring of how people are affected and remedies, non-discrimination, which sits right at the heart. And again, you'll recognize participation and non-discrimination as general principles of the convention. Empowerment, so different from participation, but this is about making sure that children and young people understand their rights and are able to actively take steps to fulfill them. And then legality, which sits underneath and underpins, works quite closely with accountability, but you need a legal framework for this to work. And actually today, the European Network of Ombudspersons for Children, which I'm part of, so this is all the children's commissioners all across Europe, we just published our statement, which we agreed last week, on COVID and a children's rights-based approach to COVID and looking forward. And we used exactly this approach. We didn't use the panel structure, but we drew out those 5 key points. And so looked at the fact that participation in decision-making, that children's views hadn't been properly heard during the work around COVID. We looked at accountability and the fact that actually there were limited ways in which we could hold those in power to account when they were exercising COVID-19 powers. We looked at equality and non-discrimination and really focused in on the fact that there were particular groups of children and young people who were disproportionately impacted by COVID. We looked at empowerment and particularly the important role that children and young people are playing as human rights defenders. And we see this in things like climate justice. We see it in things like anti-misogyny and anti-racism movements. But in COVID, we've also seen it, and we'll come on to talk to Lewis in a second about this, about young people's voices being heard really strongly, particularly around things like education. And then the need for legality, the need to put in place legal measures, even when we're looking at emergency legal measures, to make sure that the rights sit at the heart of it. But there's only so much that people like Jules and I can really tell you. The really key voices here are children and young people, which is why it's my absolute delight to move on now to start our conversation with Lewis, who is one of the young advisors in my office. I've got the best job in the world as Children and Young People's Commissioner, because I get to safeguard and promote the rights of all children and young people, and I get to spend a lot of time working directly with children and young people. And I'm not allowed to have favorites, of course, but working with my young advisors is an absolute delight. And I'm so pleased that Lewis is here. So Lewis, maybe we could start by just saying, why did you become a young advisor? Why did you become interested in doing this type of work?
Well, I've got to say, hi all, I'm Lewis. I'm 14 years old. I became a young advisor over lockdown because it looked interesting and it was something that I would enjoy. It originally took a little bit of convincing for me to join, and yet here we are a month later. When I became involved with the office, I started attending Zoom calls like this, where we speak about issues related to mental health, the impact of COVID, and people's education. Today, we'll be focusing on, well, I'll be focusing on the impact of COVID, how that's affected me, my peers, and Scotland.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lewis. And again, a good opportunity for me to thank you for all the great work you've done over the last few months. And so you were saying that you were happy to share a little bit about how COVID has affected you and the impact on your education. So maybe we could start there with your personal view.
Well, for me, COVID really upset my learning. I was losing my motivation to do all my work. I'd be stuck up in my room, finding it hard to learn. Distractions everywhere, and I'd have no real structure in place for what it is that I wanted to do. Due to this, there was an increase in stress, and there was actually quite a significant dip in my mental health. I was stuck up in my room, and I had my loving family downstairs who was ready to support me no matter what. I wouldn't see them for hours on end, and I'd be happy doing that if I was doing something like playing video games, something I enjoy. But it wasn't helping during like my struggling time with schoolwork. I lacked clarity of what it was that I wanted to do and how I could do it. I didn't feel like I could ask them for help with it. This had all banded together, and it helped. It decreased my confidence. However, work still came through, and if anything, it came through faster than normal. We'd whiz by topics really quickly. It's almost as if you could just take a glance at them and the teachers would send us something else. we were given more work, but there was a lot less ways to actually ask for help with our education because we couldn't actually see our teachers. Some subjects had done calls, mainly drama and modern studies, but that was about it for me. We were assigned a lot more than we could actually do. And because of this increase in work, there was a lot more work to balance. So we had to balance between doing the work and learning. And because the amount we were given, we'd have to do more tasks than learn more.
Yeah, and that's really incredibly tough. And we knew that mental health was one of the big issues facing many children and young people before COVID. And then obviously the additional challenges is now. So what about the broader view then Lewis? And thank you so much for the bravery in sharing your own personal experience. But could you tell us a bit more about some of the wider work and some of the things that you've heard from peers and the work that you've done through the Young Advisors Group on what's the bigger picture in terms of some of the experience of others?
Well, I suddenly started to notice that it wasn't just me struggling. Everybody was struggling. Pupils, parents, siblings, and even teachers. I could tell that my friends weren't the same as they used to be. Some of them were struggling more than others. They were falling behind with their work, and their mental health are actually quite a big factor in it. They fell very far behind, and their mental health got very low that even now, after we're back in school and this COVID seems smaller than it used to be, I don't think everyone's fully recovered from it. Everybody was struggling with their work, but no one had very much luck. The teachers were hard to communicate with. The only way was via slow email. I was fortunate enough, though, to have my emails responded to within 2 days of sending them, but that's still not quick enough. Recently, the schools recognised that my friend needed a reader and extra time for tests due to dyslexia. That's been going on for 4 years. That was before coronavirus. So the contact during coronavirus was very, very rough, considering that. With the school being difficult to contact, it did in fact bring quite a lot of peers together. Some people could say in a good way, because people who do not normally talk to each other would spend hours on a call going through some work. This happened to me each week because our English teacher had assigned us a book virtually, so I was helping 2 people with it. However, others would also say it's bad, because a good teacher of mine always says, you never learn from copying. Lots of students were messaging others, asking for the answers with it. I got messages a couple of times as well, but I would always make sure that they knew what they could do and what they should do before sending them the work to make sure that they can submit something for their own. I soon, however, realised that it wasn't just a problem with me or with my school, but instead with the whole of Scotland. Scotland had more problems than I originally realised for me and my school. Thousands of students were protesting and campaigning because they wanted to fix the exam results that were determined by the SUA algorithm, because they believed that they were disadvantaged by the area that they lived in. This is the tip of the iceberg for the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, as they then started a 1.5-year-long investigation into the Scottish Qualifications Association, which ended in them being deemed a failure when looking at human rights.
And I think that's a really powerful example, Lewis. I think all of it is really important, and that example of the empowerment of children and young people in terms of being human rights defenders, challenging SQA, but that coming from a sense of disempowerment, of not having really good participation, not being involved in decision making, and real questions about some of the legality as well. And so maybe if we link back then to the rights-based approach and those principles that I mentioned, the PANEL, the kind of panel principles, what reflections would you have on how we should apply a rights-based approach to some of the issues that you've raised?
Well, out of the 5 principles of the panel, I could only really see 4 being used in this scenario. The 4 being participation, accountability, non-discrimination, and empowerment. Ways that you could assist with that almost is that, say with participation, you could find a better way of involving young people in decision making, and even just asking them as simple as what they should do to better their learning. With accountability, it's about teaching young people what their rights are, where they can go if they don't think it's being upheld, and what they can do. With non-discrimination, it's making sure that people aren't discriminated over anything at all. Anything you can think of people discriminated over, they shouldn't be, and that should be changed. And empowerment should be improved by letting pupils be involved in designing a solution of a task. Take, for example, a homework task. They should be able to complete it whenever they want, wherever they want, however they want.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic summary. I think that's probably our time up. Actually, as you know, Lewis, I could talk to you all day long, but I'm aware that we're a little bit over time. So, Jules, are we needing to go into questions now?
We can go on to questions, but if there's one last thing that you want to put across, then that's absolutely fine.
I think we're Lewis. Was there anything else that you wanted to add in, or should we jump to questions?
There was nothing from me. No, I think it's been good.
Grand. Okay. No, I think we're right to go to questions. I see there's some popping up in the chat. So let's crack on with the discursive part.
Excellent. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you so much, Lewis. I love what you said about there being a problem with Scotland, not with you. And I love that kind of realization that Scotland needs a culture change in terms of children and young people's rights and their experience of their rights. And yeah, that was extremely powerful to hear from you. So thank you. I'll hand over to Mercy now, because Mercy is going to put some of the questions across that are coming up in chat. So Mercy, do you want to select some questions to put to Bruce and Lewis, and see if there are any for me as well?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jules, and thank you, Bruce and Louise, for the presentation. So the first question we have is from Chris Todd. I would just go ahead and read the questions, and Bruce, either you or Jules could choose to answer. So Chris is asking that can the UNCRC help us better prepare for the unknown and the impact it could have on children and young people in the future, since there could be a next crisis? Bruce, do you want to go on that?
Yeah, very, very happy to. Thanks it's a really useful question. I think the great thing about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also the broader human rights framework, is it's very adaptable. And I think that a lot of the mistakes that have been made over the last 18 months is because we haven't used a rights-based approach. We didn't do things like do impact assessments. We didn't do things like involve children and young people in decisions right from the start. And so what we need to learn for the future, and I've posted the link to the work that we've done at the European level, but there's been some fantastic work done by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, children's commissions across Europe, many others, about building the tools so that when the next crisis hits, whether that's a health pandemic like this one or anything else, that we're able to better take a rights-based approach. And by taking a rights-based approach, we're going to get better outcomes, and many of the mistakes that were made, I think, over the last 18 months could have been avoided if we'd taken a proper rights-based approach. And so that's the big argument that we're having with government and others, is that you shouldn't put aside a rights-based approach just because we're in a crisis. In fact, that's the time when human rights are most important, and particularly things like participation, particularly things like empowerment, kind of those really important tools that we can use to make sure that we make better decisions.
Thank you very much. Okay, Jules,
yeah, if I can just add to what Bruce said, then I think one of the most powerful things that I've learned looking at the impact of incorporation in other countries is the fact that it does prompt a culture change. So countries that have incorporated the UNCRC into law, countries such as Norway and Iceland, research shows that there's a culture change in which children and young people are really recognised as rights holders, as individuals with their own agency. And I think that I think that culture change is what Lewis so clearly identified, in the fact that it's not his problem, it's Scotland's problem. And I think that if we had a really strong children's rights culture in Scotland, many of the issues that Lewis was identifying with the pandemic wouldn't have been like that. So his feelings of isolation, not knowing where to ask for help, work being piled to him not being able to kind of express his views back to teachers. I think if there was a true children's rights culture, then Lewis's experiences would be very different, and that he would be listened to, he'd know where to go for help, people would listen to him, people would take his views into account. And so I think whilst there are real kind of legal strengths to incorporation, this culture change would really help us prepare for the unknown and make sure that if there's another thing, hopefully not, another pandemic, whatever awfulness comes about, then children and young people are treated as people with agency, opinions, and who really have the right to have influence over decisions that impact on their lives.
Thank you very much, Jules. I will just go to the next question, but please, if you have a question and you prefer asking it yourself, just raise your hand and I'll come back to you. So the next question we have here from Maura is asking, how can we ensure that we capture the wide range of experiences, and how can we ensure that the legacy of COVID-19 experiences have a positive impact on the enactment of children's rights? Jules, I know you just finished speaking, but would you like to answer this?
I'm going to go back to culture change again, like a stuck record. I think what we've learned so much from our members across Together is how particular groups of children and young people have really been left out. And the difference that COVID has had on different children and young people's lives. So I think in terms of our commitment together to ensure that there's a positive experience, that the learning from COVID creates a positive experience in the future, is about really making sure that we proactively reach out to members who are working with children and young people whose rights are particularly at risk, and really championing the rights of these children and young people at Scottish Government, and making sure that they're absolutely at the forefront of all decision making. Because I think if we get things right for the most isolated children and young people, for those families whose rights are most at risk, then I think overall all decision making will be better for all children and young people. So I think that's our commitment, is to really elevate the voices of those children and young people whose rights are most at risk.
Okay, thank you, Jules. I can see a hand just before then. Let me just read this question from the chat. Laura is asking, how confident are you that incorporation of the convention will happen for Scotland, and is there anything we can do to put pressure on the Scottish Government for this to happen quickly? Bruce, Jules, who would want to go on this?
I'll go. I'm hugely confident, and yes, there are things you can do. The positives are that we've got the unanimous, as Jules said, the unanimous support of all of the parties in the Scottish Parliament. They reiterated that support last week. So we know that we've still got absolute support to incorporate fully and directly in as far as is possible within the law. And that's really where the discussion's happening at the moment, is how far can we go within the constitutional setup. So this is really a technical fix that we need, but there's absolute commitment right across the Parliament and from government that we will do this. The discussion we're having at the moment is just about exactly how we do it and how far we can go, given that the Supreme Court's clarified that we perhaps went slightly too far in a couple of elements last time. So what can you do? It is really important that we remind Scottish Government of the need for urgency here. We're coming up to 32 years of the convention, 30 years of the UK's ratification. Children and young people and all of you as Together members have been campaigning for so long to get this done. So what we can't allow is any kind of dragging of the feet now, or kind of long periods of more discussion. What we need is a very quick technical fix, relying on the fact that at the moment we've got the unanimous support of the Parliament. So what you can be doing is having those conversations with governments, with members of Parliament, to just keep the energy up and the focus about getting this over the line, because we would hope that we would be able to have this fixed very, very quickly. These are technical matters. It's not an issue of kind of not having support or arguing about whether incorporation is a good thing. It's just fixing those technical things. And we do need government and Parliament to work really quickly on this. So keep the pressure up would be my advice.
Okay, Thank you, Bruce. So Palma, would you like to ask your question of Scotland? You're mute. Thank you.
Am I unmuted? Right.
Yes.
My question relates to early years, and it's much more difficult actually to keep a focus on early years because children under the age of about 7 find it difficult to advocate for themselves, so they've got to wait for other people to advocate on their behalf. But the influence of COVID has intensified two things. I mean, one, the fact that so much of young children's lives now is spent in an institutional setting, because parents are working and so on. So they have been very often in nurseries or early years of school. And secondly, that something that we took for granted for millennia, active outdoor social play among children, is very much, well, it's more or less disappeared, unless it can be provided within those institutions. And unfortunately, because we have such an early school starting age in Scotland, we do tend to emphasize education, formal education from a very early age. Now, that's meant that the pressures on children, I mean, we test them in literacy and numeracy now at the age of 5. That's meant that the pressures on children, because they're stuck inside, because they are not getting out to play as much, and because of all the stresses, the extra stresses of COVID are just huge. And we're getting more and more stories from parents of kids who simply are not ready for primary 1, they're simply not coping with it. But unfortunately, they're still being sent homework home and expected to do stuff because that's what we expect of them because they're at school. And I'm getting more and more worried about this. Our campaign is for a kindergarten stage similar to those in the Nordic countries, where children are learning through play and who are not put under pressure for very early formal work. And I just wish we could somehow focus on the little ones. I did notice in your list of provision, education was mentioned, but care wasn't. And care is what they need mainly in those very early years. So could I ask if anyone got any opinions on that? Thank you.
I can come back in there, Jules, if you want. Yeah, hi, Sue, and I think the points that you make are really important, and the convention itself takes into account that we need to be focusing on children from a very early age, and there's lots of focus on ensuring that rights of children and young people, including the right to participation, and you can do that in non-verbal ways, and very young children are able to express themselves, but that important role of advocacy is particularly important for children that can't express themselves verbally, and the link to the right to education, I think, is really important in that we talk about the right to education is the right to be developed to your fullest potential. And that links so closely, as we know, with the right to play, the right to socialization, the right to ensure that your parents and family are given the support that they need. All of this is really intertwined. And so a rights-based approach really relies on that kind of interrelatedness and indivisibility that Jill spoke about early on, is that we should never see education as being primarily about kind of passing exams or tests or anything like that, but rather set within this broader context of ensuring that children get all of the things that they need to thrive. And I think that at all ages, but particularly for early years, as you've pointed out, that focus on this much more holistic approach to their rights and the support that they need is really essential. And there's some fantastic work happening in early years. There's some really good kind of rights-based, relationship-based, play-based work going on. And I know that there's many people on the call that are real leaders in those fields. It does worry me that the further that children get through education, the less of a kind of rights-based focus that we have. And I think we can learn a lot more from the really fantastic work that's being done in early years around a rights-based approach. And I worry that when we talk about education, we often fail to recognize that the right to education is about an holistic, full development of the child to their fullest potential. It's not about passing grades and kind of academic achievement. It's about that fullest potential. So I strongly agree with the focus on a rights base, particularly in early years. Again, I don't know if Lewis has some reflections on some of this kind of rights-based approach and what it feels like to be slightly older in education, or whether Jules, you wanted to come in.
Lewis, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add to that. If not, I'm happy to come in.
I think everything I would have said has come through anyway for Bruce. So, I mean, you can go ahead if you like.
Thank you, Lewis. I just wholeheartedly agree with everything that you said, Sue, and it's something that I think is going to be central to how we take forward implementation of the UNCRC. And I'm really pleased that Together is going to be working with Parenting Across Scotland and some parenting groups to kind of look at what UNCRC implementation looks like from that kind of earlier years perspective. And I would also say we are doing some work on a children and young people's consortium to support children and young people, empower children and young people to lead some of the UNCRC implementation programme with the Scottish Government. And through that programme of work, whilst the children that we've got, the children and young people who are involved, I think they're all aged 10 and above, we're looking at what work we can do with younger children as well, to come up with a different way of working with younger children to make sure that their experiences are really taken into account at a strategic level in implementing the CRC, as well as at a very practical level. Yeah, kind of, we'll see how implementation goes. We're really keen to carry on working with you on that, but definitely that work with Parenting Across Scotland and the work that we're trying to do with younger children for the Strategic Implementation Board, I think it's going to be absolutely key to get that recognition that younger children and their rights need to be at the heart of the implementation programme.
Thank you very much, Jules. We are running a bit out of time, so I think I'll just ask the last question. Louise, we have a lot of comments thanking you for your presentation, and Selena is asking, you said that you had to be persuaded a little to get involved with the work of the Commissioner's Office. What would you say to other young people who might be unsure about getting involved in children's rights work? Is this something you would like to answer, Louise?
Yeah, I can get this. Basically, just if you're unsure about working in the Commissioner's Office, at least give it a try, because I didn't originally go, oh, I'm going to love this. But after the first call that I had gone on to, I could tell that I was going to enjoy continuing working with this. And say I was busy one day and couldn't attend a call, I felt bad at that, because I enjoyed working with the Commissioner and getting involved in children's rights work, because it helped me understand more about it while letting me get my input across. And to anyone that's like struggling or unsure about joining, like I said at the start, give it a go. Might not be your cup of tea, but at least if you've tried it, you know yourself that you might actually not enjoy it, or oh, I did enjoy this, I'm going to continue doing this. So it's give it a shot and see what you think about it yourself, rather than listening to what other people say, but don't just assume that what they've said is the only thing that can happen, because you've all got a different opinion.